I'm happy to introduce Ian to come up and share some of his expertise representing the Federal Reserve Bank again.
Thank you, Claire. So I'm sorry about the heavy dose of Federal Reserve people this morning. That's a lot for anybody to sit through. Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I enjoy talking about this topic today that we're going to cover, and being provocative. So this is a great opportunity for me. And I also just want to say, don't I have the greatest boss in the world, in David? No, I pinch myself, honestly, every day. So as David mentioned, I work in the Portland branch of the Federal Reserve. It's a very small branch. It's only about 10 people on the 10th. And I am now the Oregon Community Outreach Manager for the Fed. So after this presentation, if you want to follow up with me and talk about projects here in Oregon, I would love to talk to you about them. I will also continue to do research for David around outcomes-based funding models and other community development finance. So if you have any questions about any of these tools or any tools that you would like to learn more about, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact information is on the last slide of this presentation. So Janet asked me to be provocative, so I'm going to do my best this morning. I know it's early. And this is a provocative question. I think, raise your hand, I'm just curious, who had a viscerally negative reaction to this question? Oh, all right. I think you're all lying to me. Pay for performance. So there's a lot of different words for this, but the idea is basically that we're changing the way that we fund the social sector, or at least parts of the social sector. And the key innovation here that I want to leave you with, and I'm going to walk you through it here in a second, but the key innovation is that we're paying for outcomes. We're paying for better health. We're paying for reductions in homelessness. We're paying for kindergarten readiness, the things that we really care about, and we're paying less for process. There's a place for paying for process, and I'm not against it, but it's not always appropriate, and it doesn't always lead us to the outcome that we want. So the idea here is, well, instead of trying to predict in advance what process or procedure will lead us to where we want to go, let's wait until we get there to pay for it, and let the nonprofits on the ground innovate solutions to get us to where we ultimately want to end up. So that's kind of the big idea behind outcomes-based funding. So I always like to start with this slide. So this is us right now, and this is important for a couple reasons. And David teed this up perfectly for me, which I appreciate. And this is, I'm going to weave in your CCO question from over here on the right to sort of also illustrate how this is important here in Oregon and when talking to CCOs. So this is sort of the world that we live in, right? We're driving down this curvy road, driving too fast, we go through the guardrail, we launch out into space and land on the valley floor below, and the car explodes, and it's a bloody mess. So as a society, from a policy solution standpoint, our solution to this problem is always to do the compassionate thing, which is to build a hospital at the bottom of the hill to treat all these people who are now on fire, which is great. And there's an emergency need for this, right? I'm not advocating that we defund as much as we talked about spending less on health care. We should. But when people need urgent health care, they should be able to get urgent health care. But there's a lot of times where it's not necessary, right, to build this very expensive healthcare facility at the bottom of the hill when we'd be much better off just straightening the road or putting in better guardrails or signs or whatever. And this is not specific. This is not unique to the healthcare field. It's a big part of it, but it's the prison system, right? If we wait until people are in a situation in life where it makes more sense to commit a crime than be a productive member of society, we've waited too long. And the solution to that problem is expensive and obviously not good for the people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. So prisons are, in essence, hospitals at the bottom of the hill. And a lot of community services, actually, are hospitals at the bottom of the hill. If we could avoid needing to produce homeless shelters because we don't have people that are homeless, Wouldn't that be a better solution for those people and probably ultimately save us money in the long run? So that's kind of the world as I see it, and why outcomes-based funding may be a better solution to the way that we've been funding the sector so far. So this world has two main problems. And the first is that all of this stuff at the bottom of the hill is super expensive, right? David mentioned that the healthcare sector alone is $3 trillion. Means-tested programs across all levels of government are $800 billion a year. So it's a substantial cost to maintain this infrastructure at the bottom of the hill. So that's my monopoly man. We don't have any money. So even if we know that investing upstream, straightening that road, or putting in better signage, is ultimately going to translate into better outcomes and reduce costs, we can't do it because we don't have any money, because all of our money is being spent maintaining this infrastructure at the bottom of the hill. So the first challenge is money. The second's a little bit more nuanced, and I think it's equally important, though, and that is there is actual risk here. So we may believe that investing in road straightening efforts will translate into fewer people driving off the road, but it may not. It could be that we straighten the road and people just drive faster, and more people drive off the hill. So there's real risk there. So if you're asking a CCO at the bottom of the hill, this is to answer the question about how to talk to CCOs, if you're asking them to defund a health care program that pays for people who are already sick in order to pay for an upstream social intervention that they hope will translate into better health and therefore lower costs to the CCO, you better hope that they're right. Because the danger there is that the CCO takes money out of the healthcare system, spends it on a program that they think will work, but then it doesn't. And now here they're in a position where they still have to pay to treat the people who are still sick, but there's no money. Right? So that risk of potentially double paying is enough, even if it's a small risk, is enough to keep most CCOs and healthcare payers and other payers from, prison, all these systems who are paying to remediate problems, it's enough to keep them from making the upstream investments that we know they should make. So the beauty of outcomes-based funding and how I would talk to CCOs is that it basically gives the end payer a money-back guarantee. If you fail to deliver a better outcome, which in this case is fewer people driving off the road, if you fail to deliver that, we won't pay you. But if you do deliver it, we were happy to pay you because it translates immediately into reduced need for my costly remediation. But I need that guarantee because without that guarantee, that risk is very real. And it's going to keep a lot of these payers from funding upstream interventions, even though they know intellectually that that's what we need to do. So that's kind of the landscape that I see and the reason that outcomes-based funding is so interesting and potentially transformational. So this is not an exhaustive list. I just wanted to highlight 4 types of outcomes-based funding models that we could use to do this kind of work. And then I'm going to do kind of a deep dive into one of them, otherwise known as pay-for-success financing or social impact bonds. You've probably heard of them. But there are other ways to do this. There's lots of ways to create basically a business market environment to pay for social outcomes. And it, I think, will differ by geography and differ by policy priorities. So the first, and David talked about this already, is investment tax credits. So for those of you who are not familiar with the low-income housing tax credit, it is my personal favorite federal program. I'm probably a minority in that view, but I'm a big fan. And the beauty of it, as David mentioned earlier, is that it allows a huge amount of federal subsidy to flow into customized solutions that work in a wide array of different types of communities. And it's hard to actually visualize other examples of big federal programs. We're talking about an $8 billion a year federal program. Having that nuance, right? That ability to pump massive resources into the system and get all these customized solutions that work for the local community. And the reason that works is that LIHTC pays for an outcome. It doesn't pay for a process, right? It pays for affordability, however you can create that. It doesn't matter how big the building is, how big the units are, what color the building's painted. All that matters is the building affordable to the local population? And if it is, you get to keep your credits. If it's not, the credits are recaptured by the IRS at full loss to the investor. So it's in my mind, the first example of outcomes-based funding. It's the first social impact bond, actually, in my opinion. So there's no reason why LIHTC and other investment tax credits couldn't be repurposed to accomplish something else, like closing the achievement gap at a low-income school. It doesn't have to just build real estate. So let's build on the success of programs that have been in place successfully for 40 years, 30 years, and use them for different purposes. So investment tax credits, first example. And again, this is not exhaustive. I'm just sort of highlighting 4. So prize-based philanthropy. This is one of the more interesting examples of this. Who here has heard of the X Prize Foundation? Okay, so about half of you. So basically the concept here is you have a foundation that commits a significant amount of money to accomplish a very difficult problem. So the X Prize Foundation, famously in the mid-90s, committed $10 million to the first private company. They wanted to create, the goal of this was to create a private space industry to rival NASA. So they offered $10 million to the first company that could invent a spaceship that could take 2 people to space twice in 2 weeks and bring them back alive. That was important. And they didn't stipulate how the spaceship needed to be built or what it needed to look like, none of it. They just said, send 2 people to space, we'll measure that, and if you succeed, you get your $10 million check. So on the basis of that $10 million potential reward, right? I mean, there's no guarantee you're going to get it. 26 companies from 7 countries around the world collectively spent $100 million innovating space technology in order to win this $10 million prize. And ultimately, a company, I think it was Space One, the Paul Allen or Composite Technologies won the $10 million, which is great for them. But the larger story here is that we now have a $1.5 billion private space industry as a result of this fairly small reward for having invented this technology. And I just read today, I'm sure many of you saw too, Elon Musk wants to send a spaceship to Mars by 2018, which is, I think, before NASA is going to send anything to Mars again. And I think you can, if you wanted to trace back that success to where it started, it would be this $10 million prize for accomplishing something really hard. So what if we applied the same approach to solving a really hard social problem, like getting everybody in the city of Portland who is homeless into permanent, stable, supportive housing? What would that be worth? $100 million? So what if we used a structure like this to innovate those solutions to solve problems like that? So that's prize-based philanthropy. So I kind of made this up, points for performance, because it sounds good. It's sort of alliterative. But it's a really interesting idea. So this applies to lenders, right? So it could be banks or, in some cases, foundations who are providing program-related investments. And the idea here is that you would underwrite a loan to a social service provider, and you'd do it the way you would normally, based on their ability to repay that loan. And so the terms would be all conventional. But you would build in these outcomes targets. So if you successfully increase the number of kids in your housing project who are reading at grade level, then the terms of your loan improve. So instead of paying 6% on your loan, you're paying 5%. And then if cortisol levels of the kids living in your housing project drop because toxic stress has dropped, because you're doing a good job as a service provider, your interest rate goes to 4%, and on and on and on. So it's a way, it's not quite as ambitious as a prize or as an investment tax credit, but it's a way that any lender can build in outcomes-based funding incentives to get us to outcomes. So it's a really exciting, I think, new frontier for this. Kresge Foundation is innovating with this. Beneficial Bank is innovating with this. So keep an eye on points for performance. I'm trying to coin that today. We'll see if it sticks. And then finally, the bulk of my presentation I'd like to spend on pay-for-success financing, otherwise known as social impact bonds. And I just want to call out Chris Keller, who's sitting here in the front. Raise your hand, Chris. So Chris is at OHSU at the Center for Evidence-Based Policy, and he is leading the charge here in Oregon to bring a version of this called pay for prevention, excuse me, and apply it to a health context. He invested a lot of time developing a foster care avoidance version of this, and he can tell you all about that if you find him at the break. But he is a great resource if you want to dig into the details about how to do this here in Oregon. So that's the quick description, but I'll get into what this is here. So again, the big takeaway with all outcomes-based funding models, but in particular pay-for-success social impact bonds, is this paying for outcomes thing. That's the innovation. People get kind of distracted by the financing side of this, but to me, it's sort of a sideshow. The innovation here is that you are paying for the end result of a process as opposed to paying for a process that you hope will translate into the result that you want. So that's the key innovation that I hope I leave you with. So in order to do that with pay-for-success social impact bonds, you have to have a performance-based contract. So this ties a nonprofit service provider to an end payer. And that end payer could be a CCO. It could be a healthcare system. It could be a county. It could be a state. It could be a city. It could be any of those things. Anybody that values a particular outcome would enter into a contract with a provider who says, yeah, I can do that. And I can do it on this schedule, and I can do it for this price. All of that is negotiated in that contract. What is it worth to remove somebody off the streets and into permanent supportive housing? The end payer would commit to pay for that if you can deliver it. So that's the performance-based contract. There's an independent impact auditor written into the contract who comes in after the predetermined period of time and says, did you or did you not accomplish the thing that we're going to pay you for? And if you did, then you get paid. If you didn't, then you don't get paid. And that's, of course, why we call it pay for success. So this is the second piece, and this is the part, and it is, I'm at the Fed, and the financing piece is a big part of what I worry about. But I worry sometimes that people get distracted by this. Obviously, whenever you have the private sector involved, it introduces new risks that you need to be mindful of. But the community development finance industry has had private sector investors for 40 years with great success. We just need to be aware of those potential risks. So anyway, I only bring that up because all of the questions I get at the end of the presentation tend to be involved with this particular slide. So that's why I put sometimes in parentheses in the title. You don't always need financing, but you usually do. Because if you're waiting to pay a nonprofit, which is usually relatively cash-strapped, for several years, and only if they accomplish something that may be very difficult, they don't have the cash on hand to run their programming in order to get to that place where it triggers a success payment. So they have a cash flow problem. So that's where the financing piece comes in. So that's when they'd have to reach out to a bank or a foundation or an impact investor and say, hey, here's the thing. I need $5 million today to run my programming, but if we're successful, I will get $10 million from Multnomah County. Give me the $5 million today, and I'll give you $10 million tomorrow if we're successful. And that's the deal that they do with the investor. So it's just really solving mostly a cash flow problem. The financing terms are based on a lot of things. Obviously, the difficulty of achieving success, because the investor is the one that's taking the risk. Because if the nonprofit doesn't succeed, then there's no success payment. So there's no ability to repay the investor. So that will change the terms. Is this an evidence-based program or a new program with a great idea? That can affect the terms of the deal. And then the length of the contract. And this came up earlier. How do we right-size the financing with the time horizon of social change, which can be long, right? So that will also affect the financing terms. And then again, just to underscore this, it's the investor that's bearing the risk if the nonprofit doesn't actually achieve the outcome that they're contractually obligated to achieve. So this is an actual project. This was the 10th, I think, 9th project in the United States. There have been 11 so far. It's the 8th project. This was a supportive housing intervention in Santa Clara County. So Santa Clara has, and this isn't unique to Santa Clara, but they have a substantial chronically homeless population of about 2,200 people. I think they have something like 5,000 homeless people, and 2,200 of them are chronically homeless. Substantial problem. Very expensive to the county in terms of potentially unnecessary emergency care visits, et cetera. So they're very keen, both from a moral standpoint but also from a fiscal standpoint, to find ways to reduce the number of people who are chronically homeless living on the streets. So this Pay for Success project will impact 150 to 200 chronically homeless people. The funding will flow through an organization called Abode Services. They're a big housing services provider based in the Bay Area. And they provide sort of a combination of clinical services, assertive community treatment services, and a housing-first approach, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, that getting a roof over these people's heads is fundamentally, far and away, the best thing you can do for them in terms of improving their outcomes. So it combines all those things in one intervention. The goal of the project is to get 80% of those 150 to 200 people into continuous, stable tenancy for at least a year. And I want to emphasize this. It's not just about getting them in a unit, because that's more of an output, right? It's, we built a unit, provided a unit, we put somebody in it, give us our money. This is harder. This is paying for continuous, stable housing, which is trickier because people may cycle in and out. If they cycle in and out, they don't get paid. So they need to come up with the right mix of services to make sure those people stay put in those units for at least a year. If they succeed, it will have moved these people off the streets in total equivalent to 6,900 months of life on the streets. So enormous social benefit if they can pull it off. So this is the payment schedule, and I'm sorry, and the slide after this is even worse. So apologies twice. You've probably heard the joke before, General McChrystal giving a presentation to the Joint Chiefs about sort of the state of affairs in Afghanistan, and he puts up a slide that is just unreadable. It has so much stuff on it, and he quips, when we figure out what the slide means, we'll have won the war. We're about to enter into that territory, so I'm sorry. So as you can see here, there's a sliding scale of success payments. So if you can keep people in stable housing for 3 months minimum, you get $1,200. If you can get them in stable housing for 6 months, you get $1,800. So that payment goes up. 9 months, now up to $2,400. And then finally, if you can get them from 9 months to 12 months, that payment goes up to $6,800. So it's way back, it's backloaded, right? So if you can succeed in keeping these people in stable housing for a long time, you make a lot more money. And then after a year, it drops back down to $1,000 a month. The cost of this whole thing, and you'll see all of the players involved, and that's the part that's the brain damage. The cost of this is about $6.9 million. The total potential payments that the county is willing to make is $8 million, and that's capped. And one of the things I want to emphasize about this project as it compares to others is that there are regular investors in this project. When they're fully repaid, plus a base interest rate, which is actually very small, somewhere between 0 and 5%, when they're fully repaid, every payment beyond that the county makes is split 75%, 25% with Abode. So the nonprofit, if they can get over that sort of repaying the principal threshold, then the nonprofit is in the money. They will get 75 cents on the dollar of every success payment that's made after that repayment of the original principal investment. So huge incentive for the nonprofit to get over that hurdle. And not all deals are structured that way. In a lot of other deals, the investor continues to make more and more money. In this deal, it stops, and the nonprofit starts to make more and more money. So I like this model better. So this is the brain damage there. So it starts with, and I'll go through this quickly, starts with that contract, right, between the county and the service provider. Once that's in place and they agree on the terms, they have to bring in the subordinate capital piece. So that's the foundations, that's the grant makers, the folks who are willing to take the most risk in the transaction. You can see them listed here, which then allows for the senior lenders to come to the table, because there's enough protection there now, right? They're feeling a little bit better. There's enough money in the deal where it's not just these two CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, taking the risk. It's these foundations as well. So that total amount of money is then used to provide that supportive housing through abode. At the end of the year, or actually it'll be on a 3-month schedule, UCSF, which is a hospital and research institution in San Francisco, will come in and evaluate the successfulness of the program and determine were they or were they not successful, which triggers success payments from the county, which repays the senior investor first, and finally repays the subordinate lender. So this is pretty boilerplate. There's a lot of organizations in this deal, which is unusual, but how they all fit together and sort of the roles they play is very common. So this is kind of your typical pay-for-success contract. And I'm almost done, I promise. Still very new, and I don't want to oversell this. You know, obviously I'm excited about this. I think it's transformational potentially. It's certainly provocative. I hope it's been provocative, given the agenda today. But it's still very new. So there have only been 11 projects in the United States. There have been a lot internationally that have different features that I won't go into, but here in the United States, there have been 11 projects since 2012, and we can talk about them later if you'd like. But it's mostly states and counties so far, but the federal government is very interested in getting involved, and cities are also looking at this. And I'd just like to end with some other provocative questions that I get typically when I give this presentation. And I hope I've covered a few of them already, but just to go quickly through the list. We don't pay for programs directly because we don't know if they're going to work. Right? Sometimes we know they're going to work. I have a high degree of confidence that they're going to work. Continue to fund those programs the way we always have. I have no issue with that. But there are some programs where we're not sure. And they need to be tested. They need to be funded if we're going to solve some of these harder challenges. So we may need to have sort of this complexity, this outcomes-based funding approach if we're going to get those organizations resourced. The social safety net was privatized a long time ago. Everybody in this room, for the most part, is a private sector participant in the social sector. It's just changing the way that government mostly pays for the social sector. So it's paying for an outcome instead of a process. I get the Wall Street takeover question a lot, not just because I work at the Fed. I understand the anxiety here. It is disconcerting when Goldman Sachs is investing in a special education program. And I don't know that that's fair to Goldman Sachs, but it's a very real concern. And it's something we should all, I think, acknowledge. And we need to be very careful about how these contracts are written so that no parties involved, Goldman Sachs or the county or the nonprofit, can take advantage of the population that we're trying to serve. So those contracts are very important. We need to make very, very careful consideration of all the potential contingencies that could adversely affect the populations that we're trying to help and write those into the contract. That applies to fraud and abuse as well. Small providers are going to have a hard time participating in this market. The transaction costs associated with putting these deals together is huge. It's not that dissimilar from LIHTC, actually. And if you're not a big housing developer, it's kind of hard to do a LIHTC deal. The same applies with Pay for Success. But hopefully that'll change as this becomes more standardized. And then this is another significant concern of mine, and one that Chris can speak to very, very personally. It's very hard to identify interventions that do the most good and also save a ton of money. And that's the Holy Grail, right? And it may be that this gravitates towards low-hanging fruit, like reducing recidivism, which is great. I'm all for reducing recidivism. I would prefer if people didn't go to prison in the first place. But that's harder, and that's not where the cost savings are. The immediate bankable cost savings when it comes to recidivism is you have somebody that's not in a prison cell that otherwise would have been. And that's understandable. You can wrap your mind around that. There's a dollar value associated with that. So I think we're going to see a lot of deals kind of go in that direction. But I hope that eventually the question isn't about cost savings, but about value. What value are we creating for these populations of people and for society? And that number may be vastly different than the cost savings associated with making sure that population of people doesn't access services. It could be 10 times larger than the cost of providing remediation services. But if we limit our potential payments to what we're paying now, we're, I think, missing the boat here, missing the real opportunity for this to be transformational. So that's pay for success, that's outcomes-based funding. I don't know if we do questions after these provocative questions, but thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Or talked about here, or any potentials you see that you didn't come in with? Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Brendan Bassett. I'm Director of Innovation with Metropolitan Family Service here in Portland. And I think my comment, or maybe question, is around sort of that bridge funding. You mentioned it would be the challenging slide. And I think for a lot of nonprofits and agencies, that's sort of the mythical, the sort of unicorn we're looking for is that those funders and those payers are often the same payers we're going to keep our lights on and to really run our core operations. And when you look in the business sector around innovation, often that capital is differentiated, and it's expected to be used to fail fast, fail cheap, test things that don't work till you get to something that does. And so I'm just wondering if you've had thoughts or you have examples nationally where real true capital has been able to be generated to really move nonprofits into that space where they can operate in the way that you're describing to get to those solutions that have a long-term impact.
No, that's a great. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? So that's a great question, and we all want to grow the pie when it comes to funding the social sector. And one of the things that before I sort of do my best to answer your question, one of the things that I have to remind myself of a lot is that financing alone is not going to grow the pie. The pie is only as large as the willingness of the end payers to pay for this. So it's, what is the county willing to pay to reduce the number of people who are chronically homeless? That is the limiting variable. The financing that goes in to pay for the services that will be paid back with that funding is a smaller number. It has to be, right? So it's a two-step process. It's first, I think, convincing local governments in particular to pay more for this stuff, to pay the true value, I think, of things like kindergarten readiness. What is the true value of that? And have the state or the school district or whoever pay for that. And once that commitment is in place, it creates an opportunity to increase the financing pie. But again, just to emphasize the point, the financing pie will always be smaller than the end payer pie, because the end payer pie is what pays back the financing. So to your question specifically, I totally hear you that you're often sort of presented this impossible choice where you go after Meyer Memorial Trust for a grant to support your work, keep the lights on, help you do what you've been successful at doing in the past, or you lobby them for a PRI. And you're probably going to get one or the other. And the difference between the PRI and the grant, of course, is you got to pay the PRI back, the program-related investment. So it's never as attractive. So what I've seen across all of these projects is less about getting foundations to make more investments in this kind of stuff, but bringing in investors who have never made an investment in the social sector before. So to some extent, that's a lot of banks who have invested in affordable housing because there's real estate and collateral and there's a rent flow that pays them back, but have never invested in a special education program or a homelessness program. So if you add up all 12 of those projects, the 11 projects, it's in excess of $110 million in total investment. And most of it is not from the organizations that you're otherwise going to to get your keep the lights on money. So that's all pretty much new money. So I'm excited about that. But
Great, thank you. Next, right over here, Mike.
Yeah, I'm Mike Fieldman. I'm with United Community Action Network in Roseburg, Oregon. I have an end payer question for you. This model makes sense to me when there's a single end payer that's receiving the benefits from it. But when you're dealing with something like, say, homelessness, where it may be the criminal justice system benefits from it, the healthcare system benefits from it, other community partners benefit from it, who's the end payer? How do you determine who pays how much of the end amount? How do you deal with the free rider concept that, well, those guys are going to pay for it, I'm going to benefit for it, but I'll let them pay for it, I'm not going to pony up. How do you address that?
that is such a good question. I'm so happy you brought it up. It is usually on this slide, but I ran out of space. And it's not just an end payer problem, it's actually an attribution problem on the service provider side too. If you're ending homelessness and you're one of 15 organizations working in that neighborhood helping that population, how do you definitively say, oh yeah, it was you that provided the thing that changed the trajectory of that person and not any of the 14 partners that you're working with? So it's a problem on both sides of the equation, this attribution of benefit and attribution of impact. And it's hard. And it's one of the reasons that these projects have been, I think, too narrow, because we're picking sort of very targeted populations of people. We're picking very narrow programs that come in and help those people, and it benefits one public agency, criminal justice. Right? And they're the end payer. And I get it from a simplicity standpoint and getting a deal done standpoint, but it's so limiting, and it doesn't get us anywhere near the potential that this tool potentially could get us to if we thought, I think, more ambitiously about the range of beneficiaries of success and getting them to all pitch in their share of that success. But politically, it's just very difficult. And I think, talking to counties, talking to different agency heads, they'll tell you, sure, I'm interested in this concept, but agreeing on what my share of the value is a political question. And it's ultimately up to them to decide that, and it can be very difficult. And it has killed a lot of these deals because they just can't agree. Is this an education benefit? Is this a health benefit? Is this a criminal justice benefit? And in what share? So it is a huge limiting challenge to scaling this tool. My one tiny little ray of hope here, and David, again, teed me up very nicely for this. Thank you, David. That we haven't tried yet, but I'm very excited about its potential, is let's get bigger about the intervention. Let's take the Harlem Children's Zone, right? Whole neighborhood. Let's draw a boundary around it. Let's say Harlem Children's Zone is responsible for everything that happens in that neighborhood. We're going to measure all of the kids living in that neighborhood and determine what are their health outcomes, what are their education outcomes, and what are their crime outcomes. And if those kids perform better on all those measures than the city average, then the city is prepared on an annual basis to send them a $10 million check forever. And they're not going to worry about what happened in that neighborhood. I mean, they're going to worry about it. But they're not going to prescribe what happens in that neighborhood to get to that outcome. They're going to trust the Harlem Children's Zone to be that community quarterback and make those connections happen with the nonprofit providers in that neighborhood to produce the outcome that gets them paid. But it gets us out of this narrow view where it's just one program silo or just one public agency silo, and gets it up to the whole city is now paying for this, and it's one organization that's responsible. And they're going to subcontract with a bunch of nonprofits on the ground to get the job done. To me, that's the Holy Grail, because it also gets the deal bigger to pay for those transaction costs, which is really important. So there's the scale benefits of this, and it solves the attribution challenge that you brought up. So I hope we'll get there, but right now we're stuck in this very small, narrow, siloed approach, and it's not going to get us to the transformational change that we need to get to.
Great. Question over here. Two questions. So we'll, and you both are wearing glasses. I was going to say the one with the glasses and the one with the glasses. So 1 and 2.
Hi, I'm Emily Grossman from Washington State Department of Commerce. And as a funder, I'm going to be honest and just go out there and say that this is really scary to me in a way.
Right?
I think it's really exciting and interesting and could provoke a lot of innovation among providers, but it's also concerning because I am worried that because of the strong focus on outcomes that inevitably providers will use this funding to serve sort of a moderate population in terms of acuity, sort of the low-hanging fruit, where they can ensure that specific outcomes could be met or that there's a higher chance, whereas they would use their HUD funding, their state funding, et cetera, to serve those harder to serve populations where they can be less sure that they're going to be able to achieve the specific outcomes that are needed. And then that because these are sort of privatized and shiny and new, that there's going to be a lot of attention and emphasis on what's happening over here. And everyone will say, well, if it's happening here in the private world, why can't it happen over here in the public world? And not understanding that those outcomes can't necessarily be mixed and matched. So am I just being like an old fogey, or
No.
like is
All
anybody
right,
else
raise
scared?
your hands if you think if you don't think, if you're with her. Raise your hands if you have those concerns. Those are my concerns. Yeah. Right on. Thank you.
Those are all great concerns. And oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Hello. Those are all great concerns, and I'm glad you brought them up. And I don't want to be too Pollyannish about this. It's not a panacea for everything. It's not going to be an appropriate tool for every social problem that we have. I think it can be a really powerful tool in the right context. I will say this is totally an unsatisfying answer to your question and your concerns, but I'll say it anyway. The contract is so important. What counts? Who are you serving? How are you going to measure success? Is it compared to a control group? Right? All of that is built into the contract. So you can somewhat mitigate those challenges by writing really, really, really good performance-based contracts so that the population that's being served is the most at-risk population and as defined as something, which is a lot of work and it's not easy, and measuring outcomes is a lot of work and not easy. It's not a reason not to do it, but these contracts are really, these projects are going to live and die based on how well those contracts are written. And I will tell you that the Salt Lake project that David referenced in his presentation, this was the second project in the country. It was in a high-quality preschool intervention. It was targeted at kids that tested very poorly on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which they interpreted as predictive of future special education use. So in the state of Utah, and this isn't specific to Utah, a lot of kids were showing up at kindergarten so far behind because they weren't getting the support at home, these mostly low-income kids, that they were just immediately tracked into special education. Not because they had a diagnosable learning disability, but just because they were showing up so far behind. So the idea is we'll provide them with this great service-enriched preschool, and that will translate into reduced special ed use because they'll show up ready to learn. So they did this. They ran it for a year. They evaluated it and determined that among that population of kids who were identified as high risk based on this test that they were given, and they tested 2 standard deviations below the mean on this test. So they're just really low on this test. For those kids, 99% of them avoided special education in kindergarten, which was so shocking that everybody cried foul. Right? It was so off the charts successful that everybody said this cannot be true. Goldman Sachs must have found a way to game the system. And the reality is it's, of course, much more nuanced than that. And the mistake they made is that it was just a pre-post evaluation. It was, we're going to take this population of kids, we're going to give them a test, and we're going to give them another test, and if those test scores went up, we're going to call that success. And we're going to attribute that success to the high-quality preschool. And the reality is that because there was no randomized control trial, because there was no control group at all, comparison group at all, that there's no statistical evaluation sort of power of that evaluation. And so everybody's saying, well, this doesn't mean anything. This is meaningless because you didn't have that feature, that experimental design feature built into the contract. So let that be a cautionary tale. They did it because they had to do it because they couldn't get the deal done otherwise. It would have been too complicated to have this evaluation component in it. But now they're getting skewered, and they're being labeled a failure for having cut that corner. So just, and that just applies to the evaluation. It could apply to any aspect of this project. The contract is so, so important. Build all of that in. It'll avoid a lot of the problems that you're concerned about. Again, it's not going to solve all of them, but it will get you most of the way there.
Thank you. Right here. No, right in front of you. Right there.
Hi, Paige Teagarden. So you sort of started to answer it. We have 11 deals since 2012. Part of this model relies on investors being willing to continue to do that. What's the record of the 11 deals, right? I mean, we're 4 years out, so maybe for some of them it's not enough. But if they are failing, or if they're being labeled as failing, then no matter how promising the tool, you're not going to end up with the bridge financing.
No, great question. So of the 11, 2 have had results come back. The one we just talked about, Salt Lake County. And I just want to say publicly that I'm actually a big fan of that project, and I don't think they've deserved the criticism that they've gotten, but it's out there, and that's why I underscored it. The first project was Rikers Island Prison in New York City. So this was a behavioral therapy program that was provided to recently released mostly adolescents from Rikers Island Prison. The hope being that if it worked, their recidivism rate, their rate of reoffending would go down, and the investor, in this case Goldman Sachs, would make more and more money as that recidivism rate went further and further down. And that would be paid by the city of New York, who would be realizing cost savings associated with having fewer prisoners in Rikers Island Prison. So that was the concept. So they did this for 3 years. It was a $7.2 million investment to provide that program for 3 years. They came in, evaluated it, and this did have the experimental design component. So this was a serious evaluation. 0 effectiveness rate. Not good, not bad. Absolutely no impact whatsoever on recidivism. So Goldman Sachs lost its entire investment. They did have a deal in place. They're Goldman Sachs for a reason. They had a deal in place with Bloomberg Philanthropies to help cover a large majority of those costs in the event that the deal failed, which it did. So Goldman didn't lose as much as they probably could have. But you can interpret this 2 ways. It failed because the program didn't work, or it succeeded because the city of New York did not pay for a failed program. And that's the trade-off, right? So we'll see as these deals keep coming in, and if they continue to fail or succeed by failing, depending upon your perspective, what the investor appetite is going forward. And it could be lower and lower. And Goldman, to their credit, says we're still in it to win it. But I imagine if another 2 or 3 of these come down and they keep losing money, and of course, a few $1 million is a rounding error on a rounding error for them, but if they keep losing money, there's probably not going to be as much interest to continue to invest. So it's serious potential problem for the field, but we're not quite there yet.
We have 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to go right there in the corner. Yeah, blue sweater. Sorry, can't see name tags. Can we get the mic over here? Yep, here we go. Mike.
I'm Sue. I'm from Klamath Falls Community Action, and I understand investors wanting to know about outcomes, and I understand the importance of knowing, if your investment is going to be valuable. But what's important to me is the people that do the work and the people that are receiving the work. That's where it all happens. It's all about the relationships and the compassion. And so I know you can't measure that, but what's important is that the investors know it's all happening because of people that do the work. And
Right on.
and my concern is with the money that's being invested, those of us on the front lines, we're stretched. There's not enough of us. So is there any way to guarantee that, that's going to be addressed? And those of us who are, helping people not be homeless and taking them out to do their laundry and getting them their meds and their doctor's appointments, it all kind of filters down to us. So how is that being addressed?
So it's a great question, and I'm going to quote two people that I admire, and one of them is sitting at this table right here, Chris Keller, who I mentioned before. And Chris and I have had this conversation several times about one of the benefits about pay for success as it compares to, and by the way, outcomes-based funding generally. I hope we don't lose sight of the other ways to do this and just focus on pay for success, but one of the potential benefits that Chris has underscored is that you don't have to spend as much of your time, which is incredibly valuable, raising money. How much time do you waste worrying about the next grant cycle and making sure that your materials are in order so that you can walk them over to your local community foundation and make a case that you continue to be valuable? How much staff time goes into that? And it's enormous. And it's a distraction from the work. And Chris has a great analogy, which is the combustion engine. And I can't remember the percentages, but the heat loss associated with the combustion engine is huge. The energy that doesn't go to moving the car, that just has to be expelled because of the process of how we have built these engines. That, I think, is analogous to the social sector. Asking nonprofits who are already stretched incredibly thin to spend most of their time raising money is a huge waste of their capacity. And one of the potential benefits of pay for success is its longer contracts. The payment actually reflects the real value that you're creating and not the value that you can extract from a local community foundation, which may significantly underestimate your true value, and gets you out of this sort of grant cycle mentality, which I think is distracting and inefficient and a poor use of your time. So that's one of the potential benefits, I think. The other person that I'll quote is David Wilkinson, who's the director of the Office of Social Innovation at the White House. He's been a big proponent of this for a while, and he tells people, and I agree with him, that asking nonprofits to constantly beg for money doesn't honor their sacrifice. And we need to start truly valuing what nonprofits do, not at half of what you are able to convince a foundation that you're able to produce, but your true value to society, and start paying for that. And that's the beauty of pay for success, is if you're successful, if you're good at what you do, and we know you're good at what you do, you get paid for that value, and it honors your sacrifice and your work and the people on the ground that are doing the hard work that we don't understand because we're at the policy level 30,000 feet up, but it honors it with real resources. And that's one of the potential huge benefits of pay for success that I see that we don't have in our current system. So it's a better engine. It's the Tesla of the future, in my opinion. But so I hope that answers your question a little bit. But I'm absolutely sympathetic to the hard work on the ground and making sure that that is valued appropriately and that we give you the resources that you need to succeed. That's priority number one.
I want to thank Ian again for a very informative and provocative session. I know there's I saw a ton of hands. I would encourage you to continue the conversation at your table. Ian's going to be here. Get him in the hallway, corner him and ask the questions you need to ask. But let's thank him again for that presentation. Thank you.